They said he was cursed. That's what everyone whispered when they saw him. A tiny, frail figure wandering the dusty streets, Bassie became the embodiment of every fear, every superstition this village held close to its chest. The people called him the witch child, their eyes narrowing, their lips curling with contempt. Bassie was a boy who had done nothing but exist, and for that he was shunned. My name is Gladys, and I work as a counsellor in one of the reputable IVF hospitals in Lagos. I was married for 10 years and tried every possible means to get pregnant, but to no avail. My husband took a second wife, and I decided to give him and his new wife some space in their relationship, as I couldn't deal with constant hurt from living under the same roof with them. Now I live alone in Lagos, and whenever I'm on leave from work, I usually go back to the village for a relaxing moment, away from the hustling and bustling of city life. It was on one of those occasions that I met Bassie. I was not there in the beginning when they found him. I only heard the stories, each retelling more grotesque than the last. But the truth, the real, unvarnished truth, was that Bassie had been born into this world without the safety net of love, without the arms of a mother to hold him, without the comforting whispers of a father to guide him. Abandoned on the streets as if he were no more than refuse. He was left to navigate the world alone before he could even speak. It was Madame Tina who first took him in. She was childless and had prayed for years for a child. When she found Bassie, his tiny body curled up near a dustbin, she thought her prayers had been answered. He loved her, and she was the only mum he knew. He did house chores and was very obedient. She was very happy with him and with herself for having decided to adopt him as a son. But hope, as it often does, can twist into fear. When her business started to falter, it was prophesied to her by a spiritualist that Bassey, the strange boy she adopted, was the cause of her setbacks in her business. With time, she started imagining things, and the whispers of Bassey's curse, as she was told, grew louder in her mind until they were a deafening roar. The child she had once cradled in her arms was now a source of terror. The spiritualist confirmed it. Bassey was to blame. She threw him out, as easily as one would cast away a bad luck charm. And just like that, Bassey was back on the streets, a 14-year-old, with nothing but the tattered rags on his back and the weight of a village's scorn on his tiny shoulders. He knew nothing. He was only a kid. The sun was merciless that day. It beat down on the village with the intensity of 1,000 accusations, the heat wrapping around me like a mask as I walked down the dirt path. The air was thick, the smell of dust and decay lingering in every breath. My clothes clung to my skin, damp with sweat, as I trudged forward, each step echoing with the sound of my worn shoes crunching against the dry earth. I was not in the mood for company, but company found me anyway. A group of children, their faces smeared with dirt and their eyes alight with curiosity, gathered around a figure lying motionless near the road. The sight of them laughing, throwing stones at the small, crumpled body, sent a jolt of anger through me. "Get away from him!" I shouted, my voice harsh, cutting through the air like a whip. The children scattered, their laughter fading into the distance as they ran, leaving behind only the boy and the silence. I approached him cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The boy lay there, so still that for a moment I feared he was already gone. But then I saw the faint rise and fall of his chest, the shallow breaths that told me he was still alive. though barely. He was a pitiful sight, a skeleton wrapped in skin. His eyes were half closed, the lids heavy with exhaustion, and his lips were cracked and dry. He was covered in grime, the dirt clinging to his skin as if it had become a part of him. His clothes were nothing more than rags, barely hanging onto his tiny frame. Kneeling beside him, I reached out and touched his arm. His skin was cold, almost lifeless, and I could feel the bones beneath, sharp and fragile. "Hello," I whispered, though I knew he couldn't hear me. He was too far gone, lost in whatever nightmare had brought him to this point. I pulled a bottle of water from my bag, unscrewing the cap with trembling hands. Gently, I lifted his head, bringing the bottle to his lips. At first, he didn't respond, but then slowly, he began to drink. It was a small victory, but it was something. As he drank, I wondered what kind of people could do this to a child. What kind of world could allow this to happen? The anger that had flared up earlier was now a steady burn, simmering just beneath the surface. This was not a world I wanted to be a part of, not a world I could stand by and watch, but it was the world I lived in, and it was the world Bassie had been abandoned to. A world where people like Madame Tina could take in a child, only to cast him aside when he became inconvenient. A world where a village could turn its back on one of its own, letting superstition and fear dictate their actions. I looked down at Bassie, at the child who had been left to die because of the twisted beliefs of those around him. I couldn't leave him here, not like this. "Come on," I murmured, more to myself than to him. "We're getting you out of here." With some effort, I managed to lift him into my arms. He was light, too light for a boy his age. His head lolled against my shoulder as I carried him, his breath shallow and uneven. I could feel his heart beating weakly against my chest, a fragile rhythm that could stop at any moment. The walk back to my house felt like a lifetime, each step heavy with the weight of the boy in my arms and the burden of what lay ahead. The villagers watched me as I passed, their eyes filled with suspicion and judgment. But I ignored them, focusing only on the task at hand, getting Bassie to safety. My house was small, a modest bungalow on the outskirts of the village. It was not much, but it was home, and it was a place where Bassie would be safe. As I crossed the threshold, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. We had made it. I laid him down on the small bed in the corner of the room, covering him with a blanket. He didn't stir, his eyes still closed, his breath still shallow. I sat down beside him, watching over him, my mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. Bassie's recovery was slow, each day a battle against the odds. I tended to him as best as I could, feeding him small portions of food, coaxing him to drink water, and praying that he would pull through. The first few days were the hardest. His body was so weak, so malnourished, that I feared he wouldn't make it. But slowly, bit by bit, he began to improve. It was on the 4th day that he finally opened his eyes. They were wide, dark pools of fear and confusion, darting around the room as if trying to make sense of where he was. "Hey," I said softly, leaning over him. "You're safe now." His gaze met mine, and for a moment I saw a flicker of something, recognition, maybe, or hope. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a wary distrust. "I'm Gladys," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reassuring. "Do you know where you are?" He didn't respond, just stared at me with those wide, frightened eyes. I didn't push him. He had been through enough. Over the next few days, I tried to coax him out of his shell. I talked to him, telling him stories about Lagos, about the city life, about the noise and the lights, and the endless movement. I told him about the sea, how the waves crashed against the shore, how the salt air tasted on your lips. I didn't know if he understood, if he cared, but I talked anyway. Bassie remained silent, his small body curled up on the cot, his eyes tracking my every movement. He ate the food I gave him, drank the water, but he never spoke, never smiled. It was as if the life had been drained out of him, leaving behind only an empty shell. I didn't know how to reach him, how to break through the wall he had built around himself as a result of the harsh life he had living on the streets. But I wasn't going to give up. I had made a promise to myself that I would protect this boy, that I would give him a chance at a life he had been denied. And I intended to keep that promise. The village was abuzz with rumors. Word had spread that I had taken in the witch child, that I had brought him into my home and was caring for him. The villagers avoided me, crossing the street when they saw me coming, their faces twisted with a mix of fear and disgust. I could hear their whispers, the way they spat my name like it was something vile. "He'll bring misfortune to your home," they said. "He'll curse you, just like he cursed Madame Tina." I ignored them, let them talk, let them believe what they wanted. I knew the truth, and that was all that mattered. Bassie was still silent, but there was a change in him. He was eating more, his strength slowly returning. The hollows in his cheeks were beginning to fill out, the color returning to his skin. But the fear in his eyes remained, a constant reminder of the trauma he had endured. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I heard a noise from the other room. It was soft, barely audible, but it was there, a faint, trembling voice. "Good evening, Ma?" I froze, the knife slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Bassie was standing in the doorway, his small frame silhouetted against the fading light. His eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. "Bassie?" I said, my voice catching in my throat. "Did you say something?" He hesitated, then nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. I stepped towards him, careful not to move too quickly. "It's okay," I said softly. "You can talk to me." He looked up at me then, his eyes searching mine as if trying to decide whether or not to trust me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "I'm scared," he whispered, his voice barely audible. My heart ached at the sound of those words, the weight of the fear and pain they carried. I knelt down in front of him, taking his small hands in mine. "I know," I said gently, "but you're safe now. I promise you, I will not allow anyone to come here to hurt you. You will never sleep on the streets again." He looked at me for a long moment, then slowly nodded. It was a small gesture, but it was enough. It was a start. Bassie began to speak more after that night. It was slow, halting at first, as if he was afraid that his voice would bring down some new calamity upon him. But gradually, the words came easier, and he started to open up. He told me about Madame Tina, about the beer parlor, about the way she had looked at him with a mixture of pity and fear. He didn't understand why she had thrown him out, why she had turned her back on him, the only mother he had known. He was confused. He didn't understand why everyone was so afraid of him. I didn't have the heart to explain it to him, to tell him about the superstitions that ruled this village, about the way fear could twist people's minds, make them do terrible things. He was too young, too innocent to carry that burden. Instead, I focused on building him up, on showing him that he was not alone, that he was not cursed. I took him with me when I went into the village, letting the people see that I was not afraid, that I stood by him. The villagers' whispers grew louder, their stares more intense, but I didn't care. Bassie needed to see that he was not something to be hidden away, not something to be ashamed of. We spent our days together, working in the small garden behind the house, tending to the chickens, going on long walks through the fields. I taught him how to read, how to write, watching with pride as he picked up the letters, forming them into words with a determination that brought tears to my eyes. But despite the progress, there was still a darkness that clung to Bassie, a shadow that loomed over him. He was still haunted by the fear that had been instilled in him, still carrying the weight of the rejection and the abandonment. He had come a long way, but the road ahead was still long, still fraught with the ghosts of his past. One day, as we sat in the garden, Bassie turned to me, his eyes filled with a determination I hadn't seen before. "Ma," he said, his voice steady, "can you take me to go and see her?" "Who?" I asked. "Madame Tina," he said. I stared at him, my heart sinking. "Why?" "I need to understand," he said quietly. "I need to know why she did it, why she threw me away." I didn't know what to say. I understood his need for closure, but I was afraid of what he might find, of the pain it might bring him. But he was resolute. "Please," he said, "I need to know." I couldn't deny him. He had come so far, had fought so hard to survive every day from the harshness of life at a young age. He deserved answers, even if they weren't the ones he wanted to hear. The walk to Madame Tina's was tense, the air heavy with unspoken words. The village seemed quieter than usual, the people watching us from their doorways, their eyes filled with curiosity and something else, something darker. When we arrived at Madame Tina's beer parlour, I could feel Bassie's small hand tighten around mine. The building was run down, the paint peeling, the windows grimy. It was a far cry from the vibrant, bustling place it had once been. We stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and despair. Madame Tina was behind the counter, her back to us, her shoulders slumped as she wiped down the bar. "Tina," I called out, my voice echoing in the empty room. She turned slowly, her eyes widening as she saw us. Her gaze flicked to Bassie, and for a moment I saw a flash of something, regret, maybe, or guilt. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a hard, cold look. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice stern. Bassie stepped forward, his small frame trembling. "Why did you throw me out of your house?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tina's face twisted with something that might have been pain. She looked away, her hands trembling as she gripped the rag in her hands. "I had no choice," she said finally, her voice shaking. "You were bringing bad luck to me. My business was failing, my customers were leaving. The spiritualist said it was you. He said you were cursed." Bassie flinched as if she had struck him. "But I didn't do anything," he whispered, his voice filled with confusion and hurt. "I know," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "I know you didn't. But I was scared. I was scared of losing everything." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and I saw the regret in her eyes, the guilt that had been eating away at her. "I'm sorry, Bassie," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." For a long moment, the room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Bassie stood there, his small body trembling, tears streaming down his face. I stepped forward, putting a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay," I said softly. "You've heard what you needed to hear." Bassie nodded, his tears still flowing, but there was a strength in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He had faced his fear, had confronted the person who had hurt him, and he had survived. We turned to leave, and as we walked out of the beer parlour, I felt a sense of closure settle over us. The past was still there, still a part of Bassie, but it no longer held the same power over him. He had taken the first step towards healing, towards reclaiming his life, and I know that whatever comes next, whatever challenges lie ahead, he will face them with the same strength and determination that had brought him this far. He is no longer the abandoned child, no longer alone, and no longer the cursed boy. He is Bassie, and he is ready to take on the world. The village would still talk, would still whisper their superstitions and fears, but Bassie had found something stronger. He had found his voice, his strength, his will to survive. I took him to the city and legally adopted him as my son, enrolled him in a private school and extracurricular activities. And as I watch him grow, watch him become the person he is meant to be, I know that he will be okay. Because he is more than the sum of his past, more than the fears and superstitions of those that were around him. He is a survivor, a fighter, and he will continue to fight, continue to grow, and continue to live. And I will be there, by his side, every step of the way.